Hey, have you ever had your own parents hand you a legal disownment paper as a 31st birthday gift, while your sister films your humiliation for her social media followers? That's exactly how my night started at the Sterling's annual auction gala. While other families toast to health and success, mine orchestrated a public execution of my dignity in front of New York's entire art elite. My mother Annette leaned in with a cold, rehearsed smile and whispered, "This is a collective decision, Tessa. You simply don't fit the Sterling brand anymore." I'm Tessa. I'm 31 years old, and today, I'm going to tell you how the daughter they threw out like yesterday's trash became the only person who could save their crumbling empire from a scandal that would ruin them forever. They thought they were destroying my future, but they were actually handing me the keys to a kingdom they didn't even know I owned. The envelope was gold-trimmed, but the heart inside was pure ice. But before I show you how I turned their gift into their worst nightmare, let me take you back to the moment the cameras started rolling and the world saw me as a failure. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to love you most, hit that subscribe button right now. My story is living proof that the best revenge is becoming someone they can no longer afford to ignore. Don't forget to let me know in the comments where you are watching from, because we are diving straight into the fire right now. The heavy iron door of my basement studio groaned as I pushed it open, the familiar scent of linseed oil and dust acting as a silent witness to my return. My studio was located in a forgotten corner of Queens, far from the polished marble floors and the pretentious whispers of the Sterling's penthouse. I threw the gold-trimmed envelope onto a workbench cluttered with half-used pigment jars and rusted spatulas. Seeing the names of my parents, Clifford Sterling and Annette Sterling, printed in such formal typography, felt like a final insult to the years I spent trying to earn a seat at their table. For 5 years, this cramped space had been my sanctuary, and my prison, a place where I refined the skills that my family deemed worthless. The estrangement didn't happen overnight. It began with a single painting and a truth my father refused to hear. Clifford Sterling had built his reputation on being an infallible judge of art, but when he presented a supposedly newly discovered Renaissance portrait to our board of directors, I was the only one who noticed the microscopic presence of phthalocyanine blue, a synthetic pigment not invented until the 20th century. I told him in private, hoping to save him from a public disaster, but my honesty was met with a backhanded slap that left my lip bleeding and my career in ruins. He called me a traitor, an amateur who lacked the Sterling instinct, and from that day forward, I was erased. While my sister Sabrina Sterling was sent to Paris on a full scholarship funded by the family's foundation to refine her eye, I was forced to take out predatory student loans to finish my technical certification in art restoration. Sabrina spent her summers yachting in the Mediterranean and posting photos of her designer wardrobe, while I worked 18-hour days balancing a job as a night shift janitor, just to afford the high-quality solvents required for my private projects. The reality of being a freelance restorer in America meant choosing between paying for health insurance or buying a new set of brushes. I lived on black coffee and cheap ramen, my hands constantly stained with chemicals that made my skin peel, while my family's annual Christmas cards featured photos of them in front of a fireplace I was no longer allowed to sit by. Every time I saw Sabrina Sterling's face in the society pages credited with discovering a piece that I had spent months cleaning in the shadows, a piece of my spirit hardened. My mother, Annette Sterling, once told me that my obsession with the guts of a painting was unladylike, and that I should focus on finding a husband who could subsidize my hobby. She never understood that this wasn't a hobby, it was my survival. The crushing weight of $60,000 in student debt and the relentless letters from collection agencies were my constant companions in this basement. I was the ghost in their machine, the secret labor behind their celebrated gallery, and tonight, looking at those disownment papers, I realized that the silence of this studio was far more honest than any conversation I had ever had with a Sterling. I reached for my magnifying glass, ignoring the dampness of the walls, and focused on the work that was about to turn their world upside down. The piercing ring of my encrypted satellite phone shattered the heavy silence of the studio at exactly 2 in the morning, vibrating against a scarred wooden table covered in chemical swabs. I wiped a smudge of varnish from my forehead and answered, recognizing the secure frequency that only one man in the global art world possessed. "The endless sunrise is breathing again, Emmett," I said, my voice rasping from hours of inhaling fumes, but carrying a note of hard-won pride. On the other end of the line, Emmett Rhodes, the billionaire CEO of Global Heritage Trust, let out a slow sigh of relief that seemed to travel across the Atlantic from his London estate. He was a man who owned entire city blocks and private islands, yet his voice held a genuine reverence as he asked if the 16th century masterpiece had survived the delicate stabilization process. I looked at the canvas under the ultraviolet light, where the colors I had meticulously brought back to life glowed with a brilliance that had been hidden for 300 years. Our secret partnership was the best-kept secret in the industry. To the public, I was a disgraced dropout, but to Emmett Rhodes, I was the only hands he trusted with a $400 million portfolio. This single project carried a 7-figure commission, a sum that would not only erase my $60,000 in student debt, but also buy me the finest restoration facility in North America. As we finalized the logistics for the secure transport to New York, Emmett's tone suddenly shifted, turning from professional admiration to a cautious, almost pitying gravity. He mentioned that he had received another frantic proposal this morning from the Sterling auction house, signed personally by Clifford Sterling and co-signed by Sabrina Sterling as the lead evaluator. They were begging for an emergency capital injection of $15 million to keep their doors open after a series of disastrous legal challenges regarding their recent sales. It was a pathetic irony that left a bitter taste in my mouth. My father and sister were currently groveling at the feet of my secret employer, offering him exclusive access to their gallery in exchange for a bailout, completely unaware that the woman they had just legally disowned held the power to approve or veto their entire reputation. Emmett laughed softly, a cold sound that mirrored my own hardening heart, as he told me they had even offered Sabrina's expert services to oversee the very painting currently sitting on my workbench. They were selling a ghost they had tried to kill, marketing my talent under Sabrina's name to the one man who knew exactly whose hands had actually done the work. I felt a surge of cold clarity as I realizing my family wasn't just cruel, they were desperate and intellectually bankrupt. They were drowning in a sea of their own lies, reaching for a life raft that I already owned. I thanked Emmett for the information, my mind already calculating the move that would ensure their desperation met its natural conclusion. The contract was signed, the wire transfer was pending, and for the first time in 31 years, the name Sterling felt like a weight I was finally strong enough to drop. Inside the oak-paneled sanctuary of the Sterling auction house, Clifford Sterling was pacing frantically, his expensive Italian leather shoes leaving invisible marks of anxiety on the Persian rug. The silence of the office was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a vintage grandfather clock that seemed to count down the minutes until their inevitable bankruptcy. My father looked aged, the sharp lines of his face sagging under the weight of $15 million in mounting debt and a string of lawsuits that threatened to strip the Sterling name of its remaining luster. He was a man who had spent his entire life selling illusions of grandeur, but now the illusion was shattering, and he had no one left to blame but the daughter he had just cast into the cold. Sabrina Sterling sat across from him, her composure a sharp contrast to his desperation, her fingers tapping rhythmically on a mahogany desk that had once belonged to our grandfather. With a voice dripping with calculated confidence, she leaned forward and declared that she had found a way to secure the funding from Emmett Rhodes by proving she was the superior talent he desperately needed for his Global Heritage Trust. Sabrina claimed she could not only evaluate his entire private collection, but also provide the secret chemical formulas for the restoration of the masterpieces he had recently acquired. My father's eyes lit up with a predatory hope, a glimmer of the ruthless businessman he used to be, as he asked how she planned to obtain such specialized knowledge in less than 48 hours. The plan, she whispered, was as predictable as it was pathetic. She intended to return to the dilapidated studio I had occupied before the disownment, utilizing a spare key. She had never bothered to return. That night, Sabrina Sterling crept into my former workspace like a common thief, her designer heels clicking softly on the cracked concrete floor that I had scrubbed 1,000 times. She rummaged through my discarded notebooks and organized files, searching for the technical research that had made me the ghost of the art world. When she found a leather-bound journal tucked behind a row of empty turpentine cans, she felt a surge of triumph, believing she had finally captured the genius she could never cultivate on her own. The journal was filled with complex chemical equations, color-matching charts, and detailed instructions for pigment stabilization, everything a restorer would need to bring a dying canvas back to life. What Sabrina didn't realize in her haste and blinding arrogance was that those specific pages were part of my experimental failure log. They contained deliberately flawed formulas where I had swapped stable oils for volatile drying agents and replaced light-fast minerals with pigments that would oxidize and darken within minutes of being exposed to intense gallery lighting. I had left those notes as a trap for anyone who tried to shortcut the years of labor I had invested, never imagining that my own sister would be the one to spring it. She clutched the journal to her chest as if it were a winning lottery ticket, convinced that by presenting these stolen insights to Emmett Rhodes, she would solidify her status as the family savior while I remained a nameless failure. My father, back at the office, was already drafting a new proposal, promising the billionaire CEO a private demonstration of Sabrina's innovative techniques. They were preparing to build their resurrection on a foundation of chemical sabotage, walking straight into a disaster of their own making while celebrating their perceived victory. The grand steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art were bathed in a sea of amber spotlights, creating a golden path for the most influential figures in the global art scene. Inside the Great Hall, the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the understated confidence of old money. The Sterling family arrived with a flourish, moving through the crowd like self-appointed royalty who had just secured the future of their heritage. Clifford Sterling led the way, his chest puffed out with a manufactured pride that masked the desperate financial rot lurking beneath his tuxedo. Beside him, Annette Sterling glowed in a vintage silk gown, nodding gracefully to the photographers as if the disownment of her youngest daughter had been a mere housekeeping task to maintain their elite aesthetic. Sabrina Sterling followed closely, clutching a designer clutch that likely contained the stolen failure log, her face set in a mask of triumph as she prepared to present herself as the savior of the Global Heritage Trust. I stood near the massive granite columns of the lobby, dressed in a simple navy blue gown that I had tailored myself, waiting quietly for Emmett Rhodes to arrive. My presence was a silent defiance that my father noticed almost immediately. Clifford Sterling stopped mid-stride, his expression shifting from a polished smile to a snarl of pure contempt as he approached me, ensuring his voice was loud enough for the nearby curators to hear. He laughed, a dry and hollow sound, before asking if I had lost my way to the service entrance, or if I was here to beg for a job, cleaning the frames of paintings I wasn't talented enough to touch. I stood my ground, my eyes meeting his without a flicker of the fear he expected to see. Before I could respond, Annette Sterling stepped forward, her eyes scanning me with a cold, surgical precision that made me feel like an insect under glass. She didn't see a daughter. She saw a stain on her carefully curated evening. With a voice like shattering ice, my mother waved over a pair of burly security guards and demanded that they remove me from the premises immediately. She told the guards that I was an uninvited intruder with no ticket, a disgruntled former employee whose very presence was polluting the refined atmosphere of the gala. The humiliation was calculated, and public drawing a circle of curious onlookers who whispered behind their hands as the security officers reached for my arms. Sabrina watched with a smirk, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of seeing me discarded once again, this time in front of the very people she hoped to impress. She leaned in and whispered that I should go back to my basement before I embarrassed myself further, unaware that my name was already on the VIP list as the guest of honor. I felt the firm grip of the guards on my shoulders, their faces apologetic but determined to follow the orders of a woman who looked like she owned the museum. I didn't struggle or cry out. I simply looked past them toward the main entrance where a sleek black limousine had just pulled up to the curb. My mother sneered, telling the crowd that this was the unfortunate result of a girl who refused to know her place, while my father turned his back on me to greet a group of wealthy donors. They were so convinced of their victory, so sure that they had successfully erased me from their world, that they didn't notice the sudden hush that fell over the room as the doors opened for the man they had spent weeks trying to reach. The heavy brass doors of the Metropolitan Museum swung open as a sudden hush swept through the Great Hall, extinguished only by the synchronized clicks of professional cameras. Emmett Rhodes entered the room not as a guest, but as a force of nature, his presence commanding an immediate and desperate shift in the room's gravitational pull. Clifford Sterling, seeing his chance to save the Sterling auction house from financial ruin, quickly abandoned his post and practically stumbled over his own feet to intercept the billionaire. My father wore a smile so sycophantic it was painful to watch his hands outstretched as he prepared a rehearsed speech about family legacy and exclusive opportunities. Annette Sterling smoothed her silk gown and moved to join him, her face lit with a predatory warmth as she prepared to present Sabrina Sterling as the ultimate expert for the Global Heritage Trust's private collection. Sabrina herself adjusted her posture, clutching the stolen research notes as if they were her royal decree, waiting for the moment Emmett Rhodes would recognize her as his equal. But the billionaire didn't even break his stride. He walked past Clifford Sterling as if my father were nothing more than a blurred shadow in the peripheral of his vision. He didn't acknowledge Annette's practiced grace or Sabrina's eager gaze. Instead, he moved with singular purpose through the sea of tuxedos and diamonds, stopping only when he reached the granite column where the security guards were still uncomfortably hovering around my shoulders. To the utter shock of every socialite and curator in the room, Emmett Rhodes didn't call for security to finish their job. He stepped forward and bowed his head in a gesture of profound professional respect that I had never seen him give to anyone else. "Master Tessa," he said, his voice deep and resonant enough to carry to the farthest corners of the hall. "I was worried New York's traffic might have kept you from your own celebration." The silence that followed was so absolute you could hear the soft hum of the climate control system. My mother's hand flew to her throat in a gesture of pure, unadulterated confusion, while Clifford Sterling's mouth hung open, his face draining of color until he looked like one of the marble statues surrounding us. Emmett Rhodes turned slightly, his eyes cold and sharp, as he addressed the stunned audience of New York's elite art world. He announced that the Global Heritage Trust was officially ending its search for a lead conservator because they had already secured the exclusive services of the most brilliant mind in modern restoration. He revealed that the mysterious ghost who had revived the national treasure, the Endless Sunrise, was none other than the woman my family had just tried to have arrested for being an intruder. He spoke of my genius, my technical mastery, and the seven-figure contract that had just been finalized, making me one of the most powerful gatekeepers in the international art market. I watched the realization sink into Clifford Sterling's eyes, the realization that the daughter he had legally disowned for being worthless was now the only person with the authority to certify the authenticity of every painting his auction house hoped to sell. Sabrina Sterling stood frozen, her face turning a sickly shade of gray, as she realized that the expert status she had tried to steal was a shadow she could never catch. Emmett Rhodes offered me his arm, his smile genuine and protective, as he led me toward the center of the stage, leaving my family standing in the wake of a revelation that had just turned their entire social hierarchy into dust. The heavy silence that had gripped the Great Hall of the Metropolitan Museum began to dissolve into a frantic wave of hushed whispers and judgmental glances directed toward the trembling Sterling family. I stood next to Emmett Rhodes, watching as the intense, high-output gallery spotlights began to beat down on a 17th-century landscape that Sabrina Sterling had proudly claimed to have restored using innovative techniques. Within minutes, the physical manifestation of her arrogance began to appear on the canvas in a way that no social status could hide. Under the heat of the stage lights, the volatile drying agents from my sabotaged failure log started a rapid chemical reaction with the unstable pigments she had applied. A sickening web-like pattern of premature cracking spread across the sky of the painting, followed by a dark, oily oxidation that turned the vibrant sunset into a murky, bruised purple. The audience gasped as the masterpiece literally began to deteriorate before their eyes, a catastrophic failure that signaled the end of any professional credibility Sabrina Sterling ever possessed. I stepped forward, my voice calm, but carrying the weight of a decade of technical study, and began to surgically deconstruct her fraud in front of the world's most prominent collectors. I explained to the crowd that the expert standing before them had committed the ultimate sin of restoration by using non-reversible synthetic resins and incompatible solvents that were destroying the original fibers of the canvas. I pointed out exactly where she had misinterpreted my experimental notes, exposing the fact that she hadn't performed a single solubility test because she didn't even understand the basic chemistry of the materials she had stolen. Sabrina's face was a mask of terror as she clutched her designer bag, her eyes darting toward our father for a defense that would never come. Clifford Sterling looked like a man watching his entire life's work evaporate into thin air. The sweat on his brow was no longer from the heat of the lights, but from the sudden realization of total ruin. Emmett Rhodes stepped in with the cold efficiency of a predator finishing a kill, his voice resonating with an icy finality as he announced the immediate termination of all business ties between Global Heritage Trust and the Sterling Auction House. He didn't stop at a mere cancellation. He stated that his legal team would be filing a formal complaint with the International Art Dealers Association for fraud and professional negligence. The $14 million capital injection Clifford Sterling had been counting on to save his company was officially dead, replaced by the looming shadow of multi-million-dollar lawsuits and criminal investigations for art tampering. Annette Sterling tried to speak, her lips trembling as she reached for a dignity that had already left the building, but the socialites she once ruled were already turning their backs on her. The Sterling name, which had been synonymous with prestige for generations, was now a toxic brand associated with incompetence and theft. My father slumped against a marble pedestal, a broken man facing the reality of foreclosure and the permanent loss of the empire he had tried to protect by sacrificing his own daughter. They were no longer the kings of the New York art world. They were just three desperate people standing amidst the wreckage of a lie they weren't smart enough to maintain. Outside the museum, beneath the cold and indifferent starlight of the New York sky, the grand facade of the Metropolitan seemed to loom like a silent judge over the wreckage of the Sterling legacy. As I stepped toward the sidewalk, Clifford Sterling and Annette Sterling rushed toward me, their faces stripped of their usual aristocratic mask and replaced by a desperate, trembling terror. My father, the man who had spent 3 decades commanding rooms with a single glance, fell to his knees on the damp pavement, reaching for the hem of my gown as he begged me to reconsider. He spoke of blood being thicker than water and reminded me that the Sterling auction house was my birthright, a heritage that would vanish if I didn't convince Emmett Rhodes to drop the fraud investigation. It was a pathetic display of a man who only recognized my value once it carried a dollar sign. Annette stood behind him, her eyes brimming with calculated tears as she tried to apologize for the misunderstandings of the past, pleading for the family to stand together in this time of crisis. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the gold-trimmed envelope they had handed me just days ago, the legal disownment papers that were meant to be my social death warrant. With a slow, deliberate motion, I tore the thick parchment into tiny, irreparable pieces and let them flutter into the gutter like worthless confetti. I looked Clifford Sterling directly in the eye and told him that since they had signed these papers with such pride, we were now total strangers, and I didn't make business deals with people who lacked integrity. The consequences of their choices arrived with a cold administrative finality over the following weeks. The Sterling auction house was officially shuttered after federal investigators uncovered a decade of systematic art tampering, leading to a total foreclosure on their Upper East Side properties. Sabrina Sterling was stripped of her professional accreditation by the International Board of Appraisers, her name forever blacklisted from every gallery and museum on the planet. My mother was forced to watch as the Eleanor Foundation was liquidated to pay off the mounting legal settlements, leaving her isolated from the society that had been her only oxygen. While they were left to navigate the ruins of their greed, I walked toward the sleek black sedan where Arthur was waiting for me. He stepped out, his presence a steady anchor in the chaotic wake of the evening, and took my hand with a warmth that had nothing to do with my newfound power. We drove away from the flashing sirens and the crumbling reputations, leaving the shadows behind. I had learned that my worth was never a variable to be determined by people who didn't know how to love. The silence between Arthur and me was peaceful, a shared understanding that the greatest masterpiece I had ever restored was my own life. I was no longer a ghost or a Sterling.